Private conservancy, game reserve, wildlife reserve, wildlife sanctuary, wildlife conservancy, private concession. These words get used all the time, kind of interchangeably in safari marketing, but they can mean very different things. At one end of the spectrum, you've got one of the best conservation models Africa has ever produced. At the other, you could be talking about a fenced enclosure where a caged lion eats meat chucked at it by a guard. Seriously. I've experienced both. I'm going to tell you exactly what the difference is and how to make sure you're getting the real thing. I'm Andy Hicks, the Campfire Connoisseur. I've been going back to Africa for over 30 years. This episode is about one of the things I care most about. I've been planning safaris for a long time, and wherever I'm operating, whether it's Malawi, Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, wherever, I try to find the equivalent of a private conservancy. Low density of visitors, local benefits, wild animals living wild. The term used changes depending on the country. The principle doesn't. By the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly what I mean by that, and why it matters. I've also been to places that use the language of conservation while delivering something very different. That experience has been equally useful, because knowing what to avoid can be just as important as what to look for. In this episode, I'm going to be covering 3 things. Number 1, what a private conservancy actually is, in plain language, no jargon. Number 2, what it isn't, and how the language gets misused. And number 3, how to tell the difference before you book, the questions you should be asking. It's story time. Back in 2018, I was on one of those familiarisation trips I've talked about before. This time was enormous scale. A huge number of travel agents and tour operators, mainly from the Nordic region. And we were on a crazy itinerary going from camp to camp to camp to lodge to hotel. But anyway, one experience in particular stood out, and not for a good reason. I'm not going to name the property, but it was beautiful. They've won a lot of awards. The location is stunning. It's properly luxurious, wonderful service, everything you could want in terms of accommodation. However, it markets itself as a game reserve with a focus on being a rhino sanctuary. We arrived at lunchtime, had lunch, wonderful food, wonderful service, as I say, and then we went on our game drive. And this is where the experience became surreal. The first thing that happened is the guide said they were going to try and find the lions, which sounded interesting. I mean, that's what we're there for after all, to see the animals. However, it turned out what they meant was we would go and see the lions in a caged area, fenced off, where they would be fed by them remotely operating a gate, opening it, chucking over some meat, and then the lions came out and ate it. That's a zoo. It's a photogenic zoo, but it's still a zoo. We were all kind of shocked by this, to be honest, but we were hoping that maybe this was just a one-off. It wasn't. Because then it came time for the rhino tracking experience. This involved the driver, guide, and his tracker sitting up front, basically going through the motions of pretending to wonder where the rhinos were, knowing full well where they were because the area of this game reserve is not huge, because they're under protection the whole time as well, so they obviously are in communication with the people watching them. So we got there, there's these 2 fantastic, beautiful rhinos standing in the field, but that's really what it was. It was a field. It was obviously old farmland. There are fences clearly around. You're like taking photos of rhinos with fences in the background. What is the point? The worst thing for me, really, I think, was the fact that the guide then started to give what was clearly a well-rehearsed speech about how rhinos are endangered and how sad and tragic it was. And I'm not joking, but he actually shed crocodile tears when this was happening. And the whole experience was just the opposite of real. Shedding tears in front of 2 rhinos standing in front of a fence in an open area that used to be a crop field, I would imagine, back in the day. Not great. Basically, if you just want to tick off the big 5, if that's your priority when you're in Africa, you happen to be in South Africa, there are many ways you can do that in a very, very easy manner. And this is one of them. But like I've said before, why not just go to a zoo in Europe or in America where you come from? This is not what I mean when I talk about a private conservancy. Not at all. So what is a private conservancy in terms that I use the expression? Well, it's actually a term that originates in Kenya, and that's where this model was developed. Now, this kind of model exists all over Africa, so it's not unique to Kenya, but that's where they kind of mostly refer to it as a private conservancy. So in Kenya, the local people, typically the Maasai, for example, they own the land. They have the land which they're using for grazing cattle, bordering on around national reserves. What they do is they go into a partnership with a private company or organisation who then agree that they will build and run a camp or a lodge, safari operation, essentially deal with the marketing, get the tourists to come in and so on. So the operator pays a lease to the community gets an income, the community gets work, there are lots of jobs available then in tourism, and this provides a future for people in this area, and there's a knock-on effect in the community which is extremely positive. The community gets income, the wildlife gets habitat. The visitor gets an experience that the National Reserve can't offer in terms of far more exclusive access to these wildlife sightings, because only vehicles belonging to the camps within the Conservancy borders are allowed in there. You don't get day trippers, you don't get the public minibuses coming in, for example. You might see a few other vehicles from other camps in the Conservancy, but there are so few that this is absolutely incomparable to being in the National Reserve during peak season. The guides know the land intimately, it's their home after all. Many conservancies allow night drives and walking safaris, which the National Reserve does not. And like I said, the term private conservancy is very much used in Kenya, but there are equivalent models across Africa under different names. Private concessions in Botswana, for example, community conservancies in Namibia, wildlife management areas in Tanzania, the campfire model in Zimbabwe. The term changes. The principle, community land, wildlife benefit, low density tourism, doesn't. You might remember I told you back in episode 2 that I met a Norwegian actor on the coast in Kenya who had been to the Mara and had no idea that these kind of private conservancies existed. Now I want to talk a bit about the misuse of the language. The language used about the places you stay and visit on safari, it's quite broad. Game reserve, eco-reserve, wildlife sanctuary, private conservancy. There's no legal definition, there's no copyright on what the terms mean. Anyone can basically use any of these terms. But what matters is what is actually behind the terminology. Let me take you back to South Africa. A particular kind of operation has become popular in the Eastern Cape area, especially, although it does exist in other areas of South Africa. This is where former farmland, which is often degraded, is bought and converted into like a wildlife estate in a way. So what they do is there are farms, they put many big farms together to make a larger area and then manage the whole place as a kind of what they would call a game reserve. Animals are then introduced, wildlife, and these are bought and sold. There is actually a trade in wildlife in South Africa, which is kind of interesting. But I mean, it's not that much different, I suppose, to cattle markets. It's just that these are buffalo or rhino or even lions and so on. The outer limits of these farms are fenced in. Sometimes there's even fences within, as I mentioned in my story earlier. So what you get is a curated experience, but guaranteed sightings, obviously. Over a small distance, they know the animals are there. They're not going anywhere through a fence. They can be beautifully run, comfortable, luxurious, have great food and wine, and lovely people there. There's nothing wrong with that. But they're not real wilderness encounters you're getting here. They're perfectly enjoyable for a certain type of visitor, depending on what your goals are, but they're not the model I'm talking about, a private conservancy. It's worth being fair about the South African context. South Africa is a developed country with a large and growing population and limited wild areas left. The wild areas that remain are under real pressure. The commercial game reserve business exists because of the situation. There are exceptional places in South Africa if you know where to look. In the Kruger there's some amazing private reserves with a very wild feel and incredible operations in KwaZulu-Natal, other areas. But you do have to look hard to find a real wild feeling that you would get in other countries in Africa. And part of knowing where to look and how to find these places is knowing what separates a good operation from a bad one. Obviously, top of the list is the community benefiting from the tourism? Is the wildlife conservation benefiting? I always say that the guide really makes the safari, and so, you know, the experience and the expertise of the guide is really make or break, as well as their personality and their, you know, friendliness and everything else. And to be quite honest, I mean, a private game reserve in South Africa can decide on the level of qualification that they feel is acceptable for a guide before they put them in front of guests. One of the places I visited, both the guides that were leading us had completed a 6-month training course. That's it. And honestly, the combined level of knowledge of 4 travel agents on that Jeep was way more than the 2 guides that were basically driving and leading the trip. Across the border in Zimbabwe, a professional guide is only really fully trained after 7 years. And this is years of apprenticeship in the bush with real game, wild Africa with all its dangers, and learning how to identify, track, and talk about animals, but also take care of guests and their safety, shooting proficiency in case they ever need to fire their weapon, and this kind of thing. It's really a completely different world than a 6-month course to be a ranger at a game reserve on the Eastern Cape. The difference in what that guy can give you is everything. None of this is a criticism of South Africa. It's basically a description of a specific business model that I dislike, and one that I don't think is what most people going to Africa for a safari are looking for. And therefore, it's very important for you to know about and be able to ask questions. Most of the clients I work with and organise trips for, they never actually go into a national reserve. They're usually in private conservancies, so they have a very different experience to a lot of the people they talk to when they get home, who have been on a package trip where they've been in a national reserve and been at sightings surrounded by other vehicles. It's just the way it is. So their impression of the country they're visiting and of Africa in general is completely divergent. It can be the same country but a completely different experience, and that's kind of strange. I've been into the national reserves before just to sort of see what it's actually like. It was very busy, and it's not what I would choose. But in some areas, at certain times of the year, it does deliver, and it can be a good choice. It just isn't what I'm talking about here when I'm talking about the conservancy experience. On a conservancy, you might occasionally see the Maasai with their cattle as you're on a game drive in the distance. And some people are like, oh, I don't want to see cows in there when I'm on safari. But then I'm thinking, this is what real Africa and real safari is. These are people coexisting on the same land as they have done for forever. A real safari isn't a sterile experience where it's only for tourists. This is people's land, and the fact that they manage to coexist is incredible. It's a great experience and story, and we can learn a lot from this. How to know if you're getting the right thing. And again, it all comes down to asking the right questions. You can start with who owns or manages the land. What's their relationship with the local community? A conservancy model involving the local landowners, a tribe or a group of families who have entered a partnership with a private operator, or former farmland bought by a private company that is basically bringing in animals in order to generate profit for their own company. That's very different. How is access managed? Are there limits on the number of visitors and vehicles and overnights? How long have the guides been working in this landscape, whether they're driving with you from town or they live there? What is their experience? And ask about how long they've actually been there, not in general, but how long have they actually been in that area? Do they really know it well? Is the wildlife really wild? Sounds like a very bizarre thing to say, but there is a reason to ask. Animals can be reintroduced or transferred from one area to another. That's fine. That's all part of conservation efforts. But when they're kept in cages and fed by human beings, this is not the way to deal with wild animals in the wild. Even if you might get a photograph and it looks like you're having the same experience, you're not. And a conservancy experience does not have to cost any more than a National Reserve experience or any other kind of safari. It just gets confusing with all this language that sounds kind of similar being used in different ways. Price tells you almost nothing, as I've said before, but the questions that I've just given you will help you make a decision, and they will tell you a lot more. Just to give you an example of a really moving experience I had in, again going back to, it was Kenya, but it was in an area called Kipalo Hills, which is near Tsavo. It's a private conservancy just outside the national parks of Tsavo East and Tsavo West. They're a company there, Secluded Africa, that I work with a lot. Fantastic organisation that does so much great work in the local communities. They have a scheme where they will sponsor a motorcycle in Kenya known as a boda boda. That's an old term. It used to be used. It means border. That's what they used to use, these motorcycles to cross the borders. and they became known as boda boda, is what they were calling when they wanted to one of these bikes. But these are now, that terminology is now used all over Kenya, in fact in Tanzania as well, I think, for motorcycles. Anyway, so Secluded Africa, through their foundation, using the money that they get from tourism, they will sponsor a motorcycle and training license and so on for someone in the village, and that person will then pay a daily charge for use of the bike, as a way of paying back the cost of the bike and making a commitment to their training and so on. And when I was there, they actually were awarding. They were recognising the fact that a guy, Simon, who had been working incredibly hard and very diligently, he'd actually been paying twice his daily charge every single day consistently since he got the motorbike in order to pay it off at double quick time, and had done so. And then so they brought him in, and we were there to witness this just little basic ceremony, you know, where they were thanking him for doing such a good job of, you know, repaying back and working so hard. And he's got this great business where he uses the bike to transport people, transport goods, making money, so it's an income generation, but then also diligently paying back the cost. And because he paid it back so quickly and so diligently, I use that word again, but again, yeah, because he paid it back so fast, they actually gave him a second motorbike as a recognition of his incredibly hard work. And it was so moving to see the difference that this had made to this guy's life. And he was not very happy at school and was never really into academic work like a lot of men, a lot of people. But Secluded recognised that he was more of a practical person and was interested in practical skills, and you know, they set him up with this scheme, and it's changed his life. And he was about to get married, very, very happy, and it was just really amazing. And that was all funded by the money that we, coming into the camp, are paying in the conservancy fee, which goes to the local community and goes to this foundation. And it's one of just many, many projects they do. Tourism can have such a positive effect. And here's something I want to say plainly. It doesn't get said much, in, if at all, in the safari content that you see online, or discussions really about conservation. When people in Europe, for example, criticise Africans for not doing enough to protect the wildlife, as if the relationship between humans and wild animals in a place like Tanzania or Zimbabwe is without cost and just simple, I think about a question I've seen Africans ask Europeans in return. Where is the wildlife in Europe? How do you live with it? And the honest answer is, we killed all of it, didn't we? We basically sacrificed all the predators, all the dangerous animals, we hunted everything. That's what we did. And yet we come to Africa, or we criticise Africans because they are living side by side with extremely dangerous animals that can come and destroy your entire crops for your family year after year after year if nothing is done. And we cannot understand that they could possibly even have harmful intent against a beautiful elephant. I live in Norway, as you know, and we've got wolves here. There aren't many left. Most of them are wiped out, obviously. But every now and again, a wolf attacks sheep, some farmers' sheep, and there's a massive uproar, and the wolf gets killed. You know, it's shot. That's it. It's almost like it's revenge. We need to get off our high horse and think about the actual situation and how they are managing to deal with it, and how incredible that is, and why we should be supporting them in every way we can. We have almost no wild animals left on this continent because we chose agriculture, safety and development over having animals roam free. And we made that decision such a long time ago, none of us even think about it anymore. The conservancy model works in Botswana. That's a country with an incredibly small population and a huge area and an incredible number of animals. But that works because there isn't such pressure. It's difficult in certain areas, of course, but it's not the same as South Africa, developing fast with a growing and very fast growing population. And there are limited areas, and they also made their decisions years and years ago about agriculture, about land use. Understanding that context doesn't excuse what doesn't work, but it changes the conversation. The practical point in all this is as follows. Book through someone who knows what they're talking about, who's asked those questions, who's done that research. Conservancy experience, like I say, doesn't have to cost more, but it does often have to be booked a little further in advance. These are small places with not as many tents. That's the appeal, and absolutely one of the best things about it. The conservancy model, whatever it's called in the country you're visiting, is one of the most important things to have happened to African wildlife and the communities that are living alongside it. It aligns the financial interests of the communities with the survival interests of the wildlife. It gives visitors an experience that a national reserve or commercial game reserve can't match. And versions of it exist all over the continent: Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, Mozambique, Madagascar. But the language around it means nothing on its own. Game reserve, eco-reserve, wildlife sanctuary, whatever. What matters is what is actually happening on the ground. What's behind the words. Whether the land is managed for wildlife and community benefit, whether the guides really know what they're doing, whether what you're being sold is the real thing. That requires someone who knows all the answers, not someone who's just read about a place in passing. Someone who can tell you exactly what you're going to find when you get there. In the next episode, I'm heading to Botswana. Literally, I'm actually leaving in 3 days. So, hopefully I'm going to be recording the next episode from Botswana. But we'll see. Technical issues may prevail. There'll be a link in the description once it's live. And if you're at the point of planning a trip and want to make sure you're getting the real thing, there's a link in the description there as well. It takes you to a short form so I get to know a little bit more about you before we talk properly. That's it, just a conversation.